Hello, everybody. Welcome to 5 of our Part 6 series on selling MDM to leadership. This whole series around selling MDM to leadership has been not around the technology of MDM, but around how to get it adopted. Quite often someone in IT has an insight as to something that MDM could solve, but getting the justification over the line and getting it set up on a path for success can be a challenge. So that's really what this has been all about. Let me just progress the slide here. The previous sessions have covered organizational readiness. Are you ready? Is your organization ready for master data management? How would you know one way or the other? Defining your justification, the prioritization and the right sizing, the scoping of it for, why should we do this? Looking at the total cost of ownership calculations, what might be part of that, what might you have overlooked that you didn't think of? Yesterday, we looked at the program scope. How do you scope for quick wins? We all know that in enterprise software, planning for quick wins and then growing from there is a good way to build what we call the momentum or the enthusiasm flywheel. And we talked quite a bit about where to focus and quite a lot about implementation styles, some of the details around that, because sometimes we get implementations can get tripped up when there's misunderstanding or expectations around that. Today, we're going to talk about evaluation pitfalls. I'll talk about that just more in a second. Then tomorrow, the last in the series is talking about how to get beyond the first use case. We have found, and this is very consistent, that customers, most of our customers deploy a second use case within the first year. And then quite a few of them go on for several more beyond that. And they're the ones that get the most value. That you start to get exponential returns when you start to do that kind of thing. So that's what tomorrow is all about. Today, though, is all around the evaluation pitfalls, and it should be. I'm looking forward to this. It should be an interesting session. We see evaluations, of course, from the other side. We see people doing evaluations, and it's usually fairly clear to us early on whether someone is building an evaluation that will produce a great result, meaning pick the best possible software solution and scope and if their head is on straight in terms of how they're going about it, or if they're not. And so we'll brain dump some of our collective expertise around what we've seen that works well and what doesn't, and hopefully that will be helpful for you. I should mention that all of these sessions have been recorded or will be recorded, and they will all be available on the Profisee website. And if you registered for this series, then you'll get a summary of all of that at the end once all the recordings are available. The other thing I'll say is that we're not here to be salesy at all around Profisee, but the people that you're about to meet are available for future conversation. If you are someone who's interested in MDM, getting into an evaluation or whatsoever, we're all fairly passionate about this topic. So if you are too, then we're happy to follow up and connect. These are our speakers today. I'll introduce them. I won't ask them to do it themselves because this is the 5th time, and for those of you that have come back several times, this is getting tedious. So Bill O'Kane is a former Gartner analyst and VP of MDM at Profisee here. Bill managed the Magic Quadrant for Master Data Management for 8 years and has a huge depth of experience in the topic. We're very happy to have him with Profisee, and happy to have him on the call here. Christopher Dwight also has many years of experience in master data management and data quality and things data related. He is our VP of Customer Success at Profisee. Harbert Bernard is our value management consultant. He owns the BIR, or Business Impact Roadmap program here at Profisee, and broadly speaking, that's helping customers figure out where they're going to find return on investment from their MDM investment, and that gives them a broad understanding of where they should start. I'm Martin Boyd, VP Product Marketing at Profisee, and I'm going to be moderating this session. So hopefully that's enough to get us all started. And the one thing that I when you're thinking about how to evaluate, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. It's one of my favorite quotes from Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, and that's true for almost any endeavor. It's very true for master data management, because there are so many things that MDM could potentially do for you. We kind of think of it sometimes like a Swiss Army knife. It's got so many different things that it can do. If you're not clear on what you're going to try and do, then you could look at the Swiss Army knife and go, yeah, it looks like it does a lot of things, but you're not really clear on what it's going to do for you situationally. And that's what we're going to talk about here. Okay, so evaluation pitfalls. First topic that we wanted to bring up was looking at business outcomes, not capabilities. The graphics here, I think, are indicating, these are not the MDM requirements you're looking for. So hopefully that'll give you just a little bit of something to look at while we're talking. So Bill, let's have you talk first of all about business outcomes, not capabilities, and some of the advice you've given to MDM teams over time on how to best think this through.
Sure, thank you, Martin. So we'll start off, I just want to tie back a little bit to the previous 4 sessions. There is a running theme here. If you haven't noticed it, you will today and tomorrow. You're again back to business outcomes. So in Profisee's case, a business impact roadmap. If you have an ROI model that you use internally, that's fine too, as long as it delivers a set of use cases that can be sequenced and signed off on and that type of thing. So not just financial justification, but operational prescription, if you will. So this is no exception. Looking at evaluations and what can go wrong is, again, that mindset of how versus the why. So again, it's possible to behave yourself and pursue best practices all the way up to this point in terms of why and business outcomes, and then get tripped up during the evaluation. You'll hear from Christopher a little bit more about this in section number 2, but it's possible to do all the right things and then get here and pull up somebody's RFP template and go crazy. And I speak as someone who built the first version of the Gartner MDM RFP template, which I think is still in use, and watch that get abused. And we'll talk in the next section again about how that happens and why. But it pays to remember, to piggyback on Martin there, that you're looking at a platform. It's a specialized platform, but it's got a broad set of capabilities. Really focusing on all of them, or even one particular section of them as a first stance, is again going to lead you astray, and potentially, if not almost certainly, cause you to make the wrong selection based on things that you either won't need or aren't as important, or that could have been done another way by a vendor that's more suited to your industry or your use cases, again, at the end of the day. So again, remember that it's not an app. You don't run it through its paces to make sure that it does everything in a certain way and comes out with a certain outcome, a set of records that it always comes out with, and there's no flexibility. Profisee and some other MDM tools are pretty flexible when it comes to data model, in fact, 100% flexible. So again, you're going to be able to, we get this all the time during evaluations. Can we do this to this data? Yes, whatever you like, as long as it's master data. The sky's really the limit. It's the business's creativity. So again, you want to indulge that creativity even at this point in the process. So again, capability-driven evaluations can be misleading for a bunch of reasons that I think we're going to dig into a lot more. And I'll just sort of reiterate the incoming position of don't fall for the how. We often hear, I want to create a 360-degree view of my customer. Okay, we thought we got everybody out of this habit, but okay, what does that mean? Because I can't translate that into what I want to see from a vendor during an evaluation, whether it's a demo or a POC or something even more detailed, parallel POCs, things like that. And again, we're going to talk about this later. If you do a proper POC, or even just an evaluation without one, you're going to dedicate some time to it. So there is an expense to doing these things on the buyer's side. And what we're really trying to do here is get the most out of that set of resources and time and expense that we're going to incur, and get the right outcome, not just for the first internal release of whatever this is, but subsequent years, subsequent releases, subsequent business cases, domains, etc. So I'll throw it out to the group here from there.
I'll jump in on this. You're talking about how important it is to make sure you understand, your business outcomes, and don't focus just on capabilities. I'll kind of bring it back to yesterday when we were talking about program scope. When you're thinking about how to scope a data management program, we said probably several times, not all data is of equal value across the organization. Some data and some use cases are going to have much higher impact than others. The reality is true when you're looking at technology, right? And not all capabilities are of equal priority or value to your use case. And that's why it comes back to the use case. Because all the vendors can spout off the myriad capabilities that they have. We're all very proud of our solutions and all the things that they can do. But not all of those capabilities are going to be important for you. And the way you figure out which ones are important is by tying back to the use case. So it's super critical that you do look at your business outcomes and use that to figure out what are the capabilities that are important. You'll need to do that, not just for your initial use case. That's why we talk about a program and a roadmap. You need to be thinking about, hey, after we show success, going beyond to use case number 2 and 3, what are the capabilities we're going to need there? In fact, if you think about yesterday, we spent a good bit of time on implementation styles. You might start with high volume consumer data and do consolidation, but your next use case might be vendor onboarding or chart of accounts management that'll be centralized. So you need to be thinking about what are the criteria for capabilities that are going to be important for those 2 different use cases. So make sure you're aware not all capabilities will be of equal importance to you, which is the risk of using those standardized templates. If you just grab an RFP template from Gartner or the myriad of other ones that are out there that you can find on the internet,
that's ones on our website.
Yeah, that's a generic set of capability measures, right? You need to go through and really vet that, right? The intent of those is not to use them as they are. The intent of those is use them as a starting point and curate them down and weight things appropriately. And some capabilities may not even be relevant to your envision of use cases 1, 2, and 3, and probably you shouldn't waste your time even evaluating those things. So don't take those boilerplate RFPs and just assume that that's gospel and that's what you need to measure. You really need to tune to the things that are going to be important for your outcomes.
I tend to think of those lists as they're a useful checklist of questions to think about, but it'd be rather like going to the BMW dealership and saying with a checklist and saying, does it have spark plugs? Does it have wheels? Does it have a steering wheel? And you get a yes to all of those, then I'm going to buy it. Well, that's not really how the thing goes. Those are interesting questions for conversation perhaps, but they're not the same as an indication of whether it's the right fit or not.
I would also say, and having worked for a couple of vendors over the years, if you concentrate on the questions and those things that really mean something to you, you're going to get deeper, more thought out responses from any vendor. If you just throw the whole thing at them, and you give them 2 days to do it, you can imagine, imagine what would happen to you if someone did that to you. That's pretty much what happens. And it's physics, and you have to get it done. And if there are 80 questions versus 12 that are really meaningful to you, you're going to get some time spent on those.
One other thing you just reminded me of there, Bill. Quite often, when a prospective customer comes to us with an RFP or something like that, and a lot of questions, and they want us to fill it in, our reaction is, tell us a bit more about your context. Tell us a bit more about your business requirements. And most often we get into a good conversation, and that allows us to give a good quality response to the RFI from there. Sometimes they're treating it as a procurement process, and they are very resistant to talking about their use case. Sometimes maybe there's a good reason for that, but I will tell you that in every case you're going to get a poor quality response because we're not able to take your context into account. Just answering the question is 15% of the value you need. You need a lot more guidance than that from people like us.
Yeah, I think that's something I see over and over is, good vendors should be pushing and asking you, hey, tell me about your use cases and the business outcomes you're trying to realize before I answer this RFP. Because again, we've got every vendor out there has a Swiss Army knife. We need to know where to put focus and where to put detail and even perhaps recommendations into that response. And if there's no dialogue, it's just a blind RFP to every vendor, fill it out and send it back without any dialogue, you're going to get generic answers, which makes it really difficult for you in your evaluation to understand which solutions are really more aligned to what you're trying to do. So yeah, that's a really good point, Martin.
Yep. Let me just bring up the next. This will be kind of free flowing, and we can kind of go back on ourselves a little bit as we need to. But what are the selection criteria? I know that Christopher, you've been on the receiving end of a lot of customer requests and RFPs and evaluation cycles. What are some of the things that you would guide people towards in terms of how they should structure their evaluation process?
Yeah, this really comes down to, I think you've probably heard throughout this whole seminar that choosing to launch a data management program inside your organization takes some thought and investment. It takes a lot of thought and investment before you get started. And the same thing is true when you get to the point of saying, hey, we do think we need some technology to support our data management initiatives, to support our business outcomes. You really need to put some investment into structuring your evaluation and defining your selection criteria. Like I said, many, many times I've seen requests from customers here at Profisee and other MDM vendors that I've worked at that are very generic. And it's very difficult. I get concerned immediately because I'm concerned that the customer is not going to be able to really figure out the nuances and differences between the different vendor responses when all this is sent out as a set of generic questions. So you really need to think about how you structure your evaluation process. And many organizations will use an RFP, but that's also just one step of the process. One of the first things that, going back to what we were just saying a minute ago, is sometimes if you're public sector, you don't have a choice. But one of the pitfalls that I see is highly structured evaluation processes where there's an RFP sent and there's no interaction between the vendors and you, other than this kind of rigid dialogue that's completely managed by procurement. One of the things that you ought to be looking for is vendors that are helping you educate you and having interactions to flesh out use cases and leveraging their experience with other customers to inform what you actually think you want to do. And a rigid process prevents that, right? And a good evaluation process is not just results in you selecting a technology, it results in you being more informed about your solution and the right technology to support it. And in order to do that, you really need to be interacting with vendors, not just having this rigid formal process that's completely managed via documents. There is just nothing better than getting 3 different vendors in and drawing out the solution vision on a whiteboard. You're going to learn from that, but you're also going to get a clearer understanding of, does the vendor understand your use case and your business outcomes? So I strongly recommend against these highly rigid or structured evaluation processes that don't include that kind of interaction with the vendors. And look, it's an investment on your part, it's an investment on the vendor's part, but you should want to do it, and you should work with vendors that want to do that. The other thing is, if you're focused on business outcomes, then you also need to be pushing your vendors to not only understand those outcomes, but understand the data and the data challenges that are underlying that, which means, it's great to do some initial demos with maybe just stock demos from the vendor with their information, but to really evaluate, will the solution support the use cases that are driving our business outcomes? We recommend you push the vendors to work with your data, right? Most vendors have mechanisms for doing that and doing it in a way that is secure if it happens to include any kind of PII, but you're going to get much more a much clearer understanding of, does the vendor actually support your use cases or not if you use your own data. So I think that's something that's important to push. The other thing, and we touched on this yesterday when we were talking about implementation styles, some of the stakeholders inside your organization and some of the leaders inside your organization may not be as up to speed on MDM and MDM technologies as the team that's running the evaluation. And if what you present to them are generic demos with data that's not relevant, the likelihood of them being able to connect the capabilities being shown by the vendors you're looking at with the business outcomes they care about goes down tremendously. Right? So remember, you're trying to sell this vision of data management as a benefit to the organization to some stakeholders who may or may not understand how to connect those dots. And using generic data versus your own company's data, it just creates even more likelihood of that bridge not being, or that gap not being bridged.
Okay, Bill or Harbert, do you have what are your thoughts on guidance that you would give to a prospective customer or someone who's doing an evaluation as to what they should be looking for and what they should be avoiding?
I would say that the two things that I would add, and Christopher really touched on them to some degree, is be flexible, be ready. For example, if you see something that looks like one of your use cases, don't be afraid to ask. This looks like this applies to this. Could you explain that a little more? Be willing to change your evaluation criteria. During the process, if you see something that it looks like something you hadn't thought of or hadn't brought to the business. One thing we wanted to bring up, I know for sure, is some of the less than best practices I've seen over the years were, bringing these vendors in to evaluate them and letting them do all the work and not having enough resources ready to face off with the results of the evaluation. And in effect, I want to balance the discussion that I came at from one direction in the beginning. You want to focus on business outcomes, but eventually you do need to get the capabilities from the mapping down from those outcomes. And you want to know, for example, at the end of an evaluation, how did you do that? What did you do? How did you say configuration, not coding? Show me all the configuration and the fact that you didn't have to code anything. I always tell the story.
There's a potential for smoke and mirrors with software vendors, Bill? Is that what you're saying?
I had a vendor once 20 years ago it was an ETL vendor, spend a month with me for free. The vendor was a fine vendor, but we had a lot of very complicated data structures. And after a month, the poor fellow did a demo, and it was basically a one big code frame. He had written procedural code inside the UI of this application, this platform. And he was like I said, I always say he was out on the sidewalk about 10 minutes later because someone piped in, and again, 20 years ago said, I could have written this in COBOL in half an hour. And then everybody else could maintain it. And it's a shame because it was a good tool, but we couldn't move forward because of that. Again, this is a platform, not an app, which means there's a lot of flexibility, things that we put in, for example. So, Profisee has an SDK, but that's there for outliers, right? It's there for someone who has the product and just wants to do something that's really unique, and there's no way anybody's going to provide it, and they want to control it 100%. That's what that's for. If you see somebody using something like that to fulfill 5 of your 6 use cases, let's say, take a pause, because that means that's what you're going to be doing, or somebody you'll have to pay a lot of money to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about cloud for a minute. That comes up in selection checklists a lot these days. And, deploying the cloud means a lot of different things at this point, between SaaS, software as a service, IaaS, infrastructure as a service, and PaaS, platform as a service. And they all have different implications. Oh, and being fully managed or hosted versus the customer doing it for themselves. Can one of you pick up a little bit and talk a little bit about some of those different options and some of the important distinctions between them? Very often customers come to us with a request, and most of them we're pretty cynical as to whether they really understand the depths of or the implications of their request.
And in this, we could almost rename this entire thing. We say evaluation pitfalls don't get tripped up. We could rename it buyer beware. Sometimes things that are being proposed by vendors are being done deliberately. Some of the solutions available on the market are very complex. And so vendors will propose, hey, we offer this great hosting service, let us host it for you. And the reason being is that, hey, under infrastructure as a service, if you tried to host it yourself, you'd have to be dealing with this huge complex behemoth and complex patches and upgrades and difficult installations and multiple VMs to support the solution. And so the vendor will propose, hey, let me do an ASP service, let me host it for you. And one of the reasons for doing that is not just to add a different service or get some incremental revenue, and sometimes they're trying to mask the underlying complexity. So be careful about, contemplate why your vendors are recommending what they're recommending, and be willing to probe those things, because sometimes the recommendations are masking some underlying issue or complexity.
Indeed. Someone want to talk a little bit about the difference between infrastructure as a service and VMs and the skills required, and then platform as a service. Bill?
Sure, I can as I had to approach this academically as an analyst, so I can give the academic view. It's a little, in this case, the academic view is a little oversimplified just to make the point, but I think it's probably helpful. So infrastructure as a service, the way to think about that is, actually, I'm going to go backwards. So software as a service, we get this a lot. I want a software as a service MDM solution. And at Gartner we would say, you don't tell me why, and then they would say whatever capabilities or use cases they had, and we would say, that you don't want that, and it really doesn't exist in most cases. There are MDM solutions out there with fixed data models. They're more like apps than platforms. They tend to have been around longer. I actually helped to build one of them, and there are use cases where that's quite appropriate. They're in but they're pretty narrow, as well as being infrequent. So the idea is, without a fixed, I'll cut right to the chase. Without a fixed data model, software as a service doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There are no SQL solutions out there that say they do it, and they technically do because they use document databases. So yes, the documents have a different structure everywhere, but they're all documents. So we can call that software as a service, and I don't think that's incorrect. But in the relational world, unless you've got a fixed data model, it's really hard to do, if not impossible, to be software as a service properly, because I always compare it to, look, you can go into the cloud, software as a service for your HR app, or even your ERP. Those data models are the same for every customer that does that with whatever the vendor or provider is, and then you may even be in the same physical tables, and that's not a bad thing, but it's more appropriate to a fixed application than a data management environment, which platforms are now the predominant style of implementing. So that's that. Platform as a service, which is where we fall, and we're the only really pure one out there, I think, for MDM, is we use a lot of shared resources. We do allow in the client's tenant, for example, on Azure, a separate instance, and we still use the same engine across that and allow upgrades to happen initiated by us, but happening on a tenant by tenant basis. So again, you get the model flexibility, you get the resource flexibility, but you're not tied down to a model as you would be with software as a service. And again, this is the academic definition, so take it that way. Finally, we have what most of our competitors do, honestly, is infrastructure as a service. And even at Gartner, I would get briefings where the vendor would say, here's our SaaS solution, and we would listen and say, that's infrastructure as a service. Well, yeah, but people say SaaS and cloud interchangeably, so we just tell them it's SaaS because it's too hard to explain all this stuff. And sometimes it's not helpful, honestly. But infrastructure as a service, you could just think of it as, it's just like I did it myself, but it's not on my hardware.
Yes.
Or on my real estate. And the sooner people figure that out, the happier they are. It can be appropriate in some instances, but it shouldn't be confused with what people are asking for when they say software as a service. So I hope that's helpful. It seems really geeky, but it's important at some point in your process.
Yeah. One thing that if you only look at the surface, you may go to a vendor's website and maybe click here to install in the cloud or to bring up your cloud instance, whatever. And it may take only a couple of minutes to get something running, but what's it going to take to then configure that and manage it over time and apply patches to it and things like that? If you're in an IaaS world, infrastructure as a service, you're essentially just installing lines of code on someone's hosted server. And you still need Java or whatever kind of skills to set it up and configure it and run it and maintain it. So you may not be getting all of the cloud advantages that you thought you were asking for. And it's one of those things where you need to ask some very precise questions in order to make sure you know what you're getting in for. By contrast, I would say, generally speaking, platform as a service, using techniques like containerization, you should be getting much closer to what you wanted, which is the ability to have very flexible data definitions and flexible access to your data and things like that, but not having to have a lot of technical skills on hand to manage it. So there's a whole spectrum of ways that Bill was talking about of being, quote, in the cloud. Some of them may work really well for you and some not. So that's very much a buyer beware kind of thing. The right questions.
You also want to make sure that the code, not as, if you can't make sure the code's the same across all the environments, so you at least make sure it has the same capabilities. I've actually seen that over the years where somebody went to the cloud from an on-prem, they migrated and found out, you know, the top 5 use cases they had couldn't be 100% supported anymore when they got to the cloud for whatever reason. And, you know, again, the safest thing, obviously, if the code base is exactly the same as ours is, but if it can't be, at least make sure you understand what the delta is between the environments.
That's absolutely true. The other thing that really gives me the heebie-jeebies, and I still get this, is we have prospects come to us and say, well, we want a cloud-based solution. That is a really risky way to approach this. You really need to make sure you understand in detail the difference between infrastructure, software, and platform as a service. And then you need to make sure that you really push the vendors that you're looking at to really vet, because again, they'll just say, oh, we're cloud-based. They'll try to skirt the detail and skirt the questions and represent something as cloud native when it might really just be infrastructure as a service. The other thing I would say is if you are looking at vendors that are infrastructure as a service, what you really need to do is make sure that you get some references, some reference calls set up, and you need to ask about, hey, how much time do I need to plan on? How much money do I need to plan on for patches and managing and just, you know, managing my infrastructure out there in somebody's cloud service? And then the big question, the really big one is, how often do you have to upgrade? Are there forced upgrades, and how much effort was that? And you really need to ask every one of the vendors that you're looking at, especially if it's infrastructure as a service, right? It's just super, super important that you've got full clarity on that. And that, you know, your criteria should not be, I want a cloud-based MDM. Your criteria should be, we prefer cloud, but we also need to make sure we understand what flavor of cloud are the vendors proposing and what are those implications.
That kind of brings up another related question around skills and technology fit. How do you guys view the skills or the internal bias of the customer in terms of, you know, Java or .NET or whatsoever as being part of it? Usually they're asking functionality questions. We talked a lot about business outcome, but where does the is there a place for the technology fit in the evaluation? Bill, let's oh, go ahead, Christopher. Go ahead.
I'll jump on that. I think that's a super important consideration. You know, I've literally, over the years, I've represented different platforms in this space that are built on different technology stacks. And one of the things that is a bad outcome for you, right? If you're selling MDM to your organization, your leadership, the bad outcome is to select a solution, a technology solution that has all the bells and whistles that you thought you wanted, then come to find out there's certain skills required to configure and maintain it that you don't have. And now you're either going to have to go out and spend money on consultants or hire in those skills. And, you know, that's not a fun conversation to go back to leadership with. So it's important that you think about, hey, what is the underlying technology? If I do need to do something truly unique and one-off and use an API or an extension, what are the tools and skills that are required to do that? And are those skills and tools that we already have? Those resources that we have available, you know, that we could allocate towards that purpose versus having to go hire or get consultants or third parties. And it's often that's part of the criteria, but sometimes I see it overlooked by prospects. And again, that scares me because it's a risk factor.
Exactly. Sometimes we in evaluations, we're asked questions when it about, you know, can you do X or can you do Y? And it feels like we're being asked about the latest, you know, fad that may or may not be relevant. Can you, Christopher, talk a little bit about product features that might sound great, but may or may not be as what the customer expects, or something that we think they may never even use?
So there's two things here. I put those as the pie in the sky requirements, right, that come out from people that, hey, we wanted to do X, Y, and Z. And if you actually probe and ask, well, why do you need that? And what are the specific use cases and business outcomes? They usually stumble. It's usually because well, it's neat, or it's hot, or it's a cool technology, right? That's not a very good evaluation criteria. And often those capabilities don't even end up being utilized. So I'm always a little bit nervous about some of these pie in the sky requirements. And the reality is, look, we're technologists. Most of the people that are evaluating MDM technologies are technologists, and we are interested in technology innovation. And so we are attracted to the new hot things. You need to make sure that the criteria that you're driving to and the capabilities that are relevant are tied to a specific business outcome, not some hot new buzzword, right? Because we get excited by the buzzwords. Software vendors are guilty of latching onto buzzwords and throwing them into their marketing material, whether they're relevant or not. We're sort of like moths to a light if there's some new buzzword out there. So, Bill, I'm going to tee this one up for you because you and I have talked about this so much. One of them that comes up all the time is, hey, we want an MDM solution with machine learning for matching. And while machine learning and AI are hot, wouldn't it be cool if we could have machine learning for matching? And there's even some vendors that are kind of purporting that they do so. I know from our conversations, Bill, you've got an opinion there.
Yeah, and it's not that they don't do it, it's that it comes under the category of, if I could use that kind of stuff, I probably wouldn't have needed MDM in the first place, which means, my incoming source data would already have been something that I can rely on. And the ML topic came up at a CIO forum in Phoenix I did that was great in December, where at the end, I took questions, and one of the ones that came up multiple times was, how do you make use of that stuff when you can't really do very good root cause analysis when there's a problem? When it's procedural code, you can go right back to whatever piece of data it was that screwed you up. When it's ML, it gets harder. I won't say it's impossible, but there's another layer of abstraction there, and it gets tough. That's compounded when you're dealing with overall data quality and the use of that data downstream. The short version of the story, like I said sarcastically, is if I had the quality of data that would enable those engines to work, I wouldn't need MDM. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. And I do need the good news is I do need MDM. If I do MDM I'm going to say sort of the more traditional sense, I will be able to do that stuff eventually, but not in the first year or 18 months or 2 years. And what you want is a vendor that's going to be honest with you about that. And there are other examples of that. There are vendors, we do a little of this, but it's not something you're going to use very well initially. And that's trust scoring of sources. Sometimes at the attribute level, again, if I could do that, I would know way more about my data than I know today. And I might know that in a couple of years based on the tooling that I'm going to use and the outcomes I want. But again, I don't want to buy based on that, because that's not going to help me deliver my first 3, 4, 5 business outcomes. It just isn't, right?
The other thing is, if you think about this, right, you train a model against data sets, and generally you need a large volume of data to make those models learn. And the reality is, most MDM use cases, there's simply not enough volume of data for that to actually be practical, right? Because we're looking only at master data. If you're applying that to transaction data, you might have oodles of volume, and there's something for the model to learn. But when you're looking at master data, the volumes are usually much, much lower. And so it's kind of a non-starter. But the other thing that Bill mentioned, I think, is super important, is that if you were to really think about it, if I had an ML engine that figured out my matching for me, the dreamy vision here is that it automatically solves all my problems and matches perfectly. There's no engine that's going to do that. And the dilemma of applying ML to matching is what Bill suggested a little earlier, is that it's much more of a black box. I look way back earlier in my career, and some of the matching technologies that were part of the solutions I represented, sometimes homegrown, sometimes OEM, that was the largest complaint from the customer was, hey, this is so esoteric that when I get an unexpected match result, I can't figure out how to unravel it. I can't figure out what went wrong. I can't figure out how the source data caused that action or that outcome. And I sure as heck can't figure out how to tune and adjust it. Right? And so if you were to have an ML-based match engine and you get unexpected results, which is inevitable, it's way, way more difficult to figure out how to unravel it. And in many cases, the only thing you can do is correct the source data. Wait a minute, that's what the MDM solution is supposed to be doing. So now you're going to be doing pre-MDM before your MDM in order to make this magical matching work, which is just kind of crazy.
And I saw a lot of, just to hammer it home, I mean, I saw a lot of implementers run into this same problem with just a non-ML probabilistic matching engine. You know, I got here, I like this result, but if someone asks me how I got it, I won't be able to reverse engineer it. I got lost. And a lot of them would say, you know what, I'm shutting off the probabilistic option and I'm going to start over with deterministic and see how far I get. And then I'll just increment because, you know, heaven help me, I can't explain this. I really, you know, it looks perfect, but I can't explain it.
Yep. Right, folks, thank you for that, guys. We've had a few questions coming in that I think we've covered a few of them, most of them actually, as we've gone through the conversation. And I see at least one or two that we'll come back to in just a minute. But if anyone has any questions on any topic, please just drop them into the chat and we'll try and cover them before we're done. Let's move to the next topic of let me do that. It's updating too slow. Of what to look for. Harbert, can you talk a little bit about total cost of ownership from an evaluation perspective for your initial use case as well as for future, you know, thinking about the out years as well as the initial implementation?
Absolutely. And before I go there, we were talking about if you don't know where you're going, any road will do. So, you know, when you think about total cost of ownership, you need to understand what you're trying to accomplish, because that will definitely affect total cost of ownership. And to talk a little bit about what Christopher was talking about, you know, your skills also affect your total cost of ownership. So if you don't have those skills in-house, say you're a Java stack and the solution you're buying is Microsoft C++, then, you know, you're going to have a different total cost of ownership. So all these things affect total cost of ownership. Also to think about, you know, your total cost of ownership is kind of, you know, your licensing, your subscription model versus your perpetual license. And some things to take into account is you need to understand, you know, kind of what likely will be price increases from the vendor in the out years. And a good rule of thumb is you need to negotiate caps into your contract so you have some certainty in your total cost of ownership. It's also a little bit like a car. We've used the analogy of a car several instances. It's kind of like the lease versus purchase. So if you're doing some type of subscription model, it's akin to leasing a car versus a perpetual license where you're actually kind of buying the software. And that obviously has implications versus operating expenses versus being able to capitalize it. We talked a little bit about that a few webinars ago. If you're leasing, you're gonna hit your operating budget. If you're gonna buy the software, most likely it's gonna hit your capital budget. You also need to understand your ongoing maintenance cost and, you know, how that fits into your total cost of ownership. And even though total cost of ownership is critically important, it's what you're doing, you have to get a budget, you have to get this approved. It's one component of the value delivered. So going back to, we're talking about understanding what you're trying to accomplish and what that means from a business outcomes perspective. Really what you want at the end of the day is you want the most value for your company. So, and that's two sides of the equation. There's a cost side and there's a benefit side. And Bill had used that wonderful diagram a few webinars ago showing the cost efficiency of revenue and what that means when you optimize. So at the end of the day, you need to think of total cost of ownership in relation to the value you're trying to achieve. So obviously we're talking about business outcomes, and the capabilities are what enable and give you those business outcomes. So when you're going through and you're talking through to your vendors and you're going through the selection process, you really need to understand that those critical capabilities that are going to enable those business outcomes and which are going to help you achieve the greatest value for your organization. Total cost of ownership is an important part of it. You need to minimize it, but you don't want to be penny wise and pound foolish. I think that's really important. So if you try to squeeze your total cost of ownership in a way that affects you're not getting the capabilities and it affects your the value you can achieve, at the end of the day, you're going to be worse off. So think about the big picture, total cost of ownership, not just in the first year, but in the out years and how you're going to grow with the solution.
Christopher, I think you're talking, but you're I had some background noise there, so I muted myself. I'll jump in for just a quick second, just because A couple other things. When you think about pitfalls, there's two things where I see prospects make mistakes, and I wouldn't want anybody on this session to make those same mistakes. One of them is they don't really put enough effort into requiring their vendors or the consultants that they're going to use to put together detailed estimates for the effort to configure the solution for the desired outcomes. And that needs to be not just the initial use case, you need to be doing that for however many use cases you've clearly identified. And that takes work, right? That means you have to define requirements and the vendor has to prepare detailed estimates. And you might even get pushback internally on getting all those requirements more clearly ironed out, and you may get pushback from your vendors. But that is many times the larger portion of TCO, particularly for some of the other solutions on the market that are more heavy lifting to implement. There can be some really, really unpleasant surprises on the effort required in the out years. Right? So you might have your initial use case well hammered out, you get a good estimate, you go to use case number 2, and then it's just a showstopper. Right? And that's not a very good outcome for your MDM program. The other thing that I see over and over is when people are evaluating different vendors, they don't invest enough to clearly understand the license metrics. Almost every solution that you look at in technology, MDM is no different, has some notion of license metrics that scale the license. Right? It's going to be less expensive for a small solution, it's going to be more expensive for a large solution. When you're thinking about a data management program, we've said it before, start small, think big. You need to understand what those license implications are, because almost any license available in the market is going to scale as you grow your program, but you don't want to have that happen in unpleasant and surprising ways. And so you need to make sure you truly understand the details of the metrics. Our world, it's the number of rows and number of attributes. There's many other metrics in use, and sometimes there's blended metrics. It could be some notion of volume as well as some type of different named seats and different levels of named seats, and heaven forbid if the notion of domain or domain-specific records is part of it. You know, those all need to be figured out, and it needs to be plugged into your 5-year model that, hey, when we go to this next use case, there is going to be an incremental license, and you really need to hammer the vendors to be able to understand, is it apples to apples, or is that incremental license going to be more with one solution than another? And it's often overlooked. I urge everybody here to not to fall into that trap. It's because it's
Christopher, I've heard you talk about. Bill talked about, you got to have the vendor lift the hood and show you what they actually did. I've heard you talk about sometimes there's hidden complexity in the product structure itself. How would you advise someone to uncover that so they don't step on a landmine?
Yeah, that's another big landmine, right? Is every vendor will want to make their solution look as attractive and as easy as possible, right? That's just the nature of when you've got a product that you want to present to the market, you're going to try to make it look its most positive light, and every vendor will do that. We will do that. It's incumbent on you to really dig under the surface, or as Martin has said, to keep going back to our analogies here, you really need to force the vendor to open the hood. And sometimes they don't want to. They don't want to show you, hey, what's actually underneath this? You showed me this great demo and it looked like it was pretty fluid end to end, but was it really actually under the hood fluid end to end, right? Is it a car made entirely by Toyota, or is it cobbled together from Toyota and BMW and Chevy and Buick and Yugo? So you've got to force the vendor to open the hood to make sure there's no surprises. And there's 2 ways that I like to do that. I recommend everybody looking at solutions do this. One of them goes back to the licensing metrics. Require that your vendors give you a detailed line item quote so that you understand specifically what are the line items, all the SKUs that are required to deliver what's been shown, right? You've shown me this great solution for my business outcomes and use cases. What are the specific line item SKUs that I need to buy in order to deliver that capability? And the thing you're looking for is, if there's a couple of different metrics to scale the license, that's pretty typical. When you start to get half a dozen or a dozen different metrics, there's users, domains, and records, and cores. When you start to see many, many metrics layered together, that's kind of hinting to you that, hey, there's a lot of underlying complexity here. There's probably different technologies that have historically been licensed different ways that have been cobbled together. So that's one of the tip-offs that, hey, there's maybe more complexity that you need to dig into. The other one I love is ask for the installation guides, and go ahead and say it plural. don't say send me the installation guide. Say, hey, we might install this in our own infrastructure. Maybe that's on-prem or in our cloud vendor of choice. But if we're going to install it ourselves, I want to know what I'm up to. You know, if our team has to do it, send me the installation guides in order to deliver everything you've showed me. And ideally, you'll get a nice, concise PDF of 20 pages or 30 pages, and that's the installation guide. What you may find from some of the solutions on the market is you're going to get a 6 or 7 PDFs. They're anywhere from 50 to 150 pages long because the solution is actually comprised of multiple technology stacks. And that's one of the best ways to uncover that. So, you know, in the
From
demo,
acquisitions and things like that, right? That's why they would have multiple installation guides.
Yeah. So, you know, it's back to the car analogy. The vendor's going to want you to focus on the test drive, right? Look how shiny it is, look how pretty it is, and let's go for a test drive. You definitely need to say, let me open the hood. And license metrics and installation guides are some of the ways to try to pry open the hood.
Okay.
I'd like to say something real quick.
Go ahead.
The same due diligence should be done with the system integrator also. So if you're using a system integrator and you need to understand what their perspective on this is. I've been around system integrators for the last 15, 20 years, and oftentimes system integrators want the most complex software because they can, you know, charge to maintain it and, you know, do customizations, things like that. So understanding what your system integrator is doing and why they're doing it, I think is a critical point in to managing your total cost of ownership. And also goes back to understanding what you want to do for your business.
Yeah.
Perfect. You know, I think we've covered pretty much all of the questions that have come up in chat. So we have a couple more minutes. If anyone has any more questions, please drop them in now. There was one that I couldn't work into the questions, so I'm going to loop back and talk about. There was a question about how do you identify master data, and just Bill, could you just give us a quick recap on the definition and usage of master data, just for anybody that you know,
Sure. As a recovering data modeler, I will do that.
Thank you.
If you ever really recover, I'm not sure.
You're scarred for life either way, right?
Yeah. So, you know, the sort of mid-business level definition is it's data that's widely shared. So, you know, and again, widely, these are terms of art. So one person's widely might not be another person's widely, but this is as close as we can get, and I'll give a sort of data modeler's definition in a minute, but it's widely shared. So what is that? You know, you could use the old data warehouse axiom of, look, if 2 people need it, it's not, but if 3 people need it, it is. It can literally be that simple and stark, or you could make it more complex. So widely shared. The other one that's a little more easily, although not completely identifiable, is slowly changing. So anyone who's familiar with slowly changing dimensions in dimensional modeling, that's what we're talking about. You know, what's slowly? I'll come back to that in a second. But in general, if there are any other data modelers out there, if you were to, I'm not saying to do this, but if you were to build a snowflake model of your entire operational enterprise and then remove the fact tables, everything that's left would be master data. And that includes reference data. We talked about code tables in one of the other sessions. That's a subgenre of master data. Gartner would use a fancy term like master data management, but on controlled vocabularies. That's reference data. But it has the same characteristics. Metadata as well. We've been having more and more of these discussions. You can use our tool, for example, to manage metadata as a catalog because, again, it changes slowly and it's widely shared. So all of our capabilities can be deployed that way as well. So again, you know, and again, so there are gray areas. So what's a good gray area? So so master data is state-driven. Another way to say it, non-master data is event-driven. It may contain master data elements like an insurance claim, probably has the insurer's name on it in terms of a data record, but it's probably not the system of record for the insurer's name that came from somewhere, and that's the system of record, whether it's MDM or not. So again, there are gray areas. So we usually say, look, if it changes, if the data attribute changes every time there's an interaction or a transaction, probably not master data, almost certainly not master data, but there are gray areas. I'll just throw out one example that people tend to come up with. Highest invoice amount over the last year. Well, that probably only changes when a new high is reached, right? But you have to check every invoice to see if that's what happened. So again, the data element itself probably doesn't update a lot, but it carries all the workload implications of a rapidly changing data attribute. So again, that's a gray area. That could be master data, it might not. Do I include, so I decide to tier my B2C customers. Do I want that tier in the master data? Well, okay, how often do your rules change? If they hardly ever change, and if I become silver or gold or platinum, does that tend to last a really long time? Yeah, okay. Then the next question, like the other one, is how often am I going to check that? Because I will have to go back and get all his stuff to do that, depending on what my rules are. So again, there are gray areas, but in general, you want to keep raw transactional and interactional data out of the picture for an MDM hub. You'll integrate to it, but you won't capture it.
That Bill's answer is absolutely correct. If you're talking to leadership or non-technology stakeholders, they'll struggle with this to understand what's master data and what's not. The easiest way to boil it down is almost at a childish level. It's the nouns of the business, right? What's a noun? A person, place, or thing. So it's customers, it's materials, it's products. And particularly, when do you need an MDM solution? When that same information resides in more than one system or is tied to more than one process. So if I have customer data in my CRM and in my billing system and in my order fulfillment system, there's the propensity for that data to be misaligned, and that's where master data comes in. But it's all about the customer or the product. So when you're talking to stakeholders, and they're saying, well, what's master data and what's not? I just go back to that simple definition of, hey, it's the nouns that drive your business. A slightly more detailed tack was what IDC used to use years ago, Bill. You probably remember this. This is like 15 or 20 years ago. They kind of took the other way. They said, really, if you break it down, a transaction is nothing more than a timestamp and a quantity, and everything else about that transaction, whether it's the issuance of a policy or the purchase of a widget, everything else about that transaction is probably master data, right? A customer bought a thing at a store with the help of a salesperson. Well, a customer, product, facility, or location, an employee, and that's all master data.
Excellent. Thanks, you guys. That covers off, I think that covers off all the questions that have been in the chat. So thank you for everyone who submitted questions, and thanks, guys, for covering them. We'll wrap up here because we're at the top of the hour. And one thing I just realized, excuse me, that didn't really come up today was the whole, we touched on it in a few different ways, but the whole idea of multiple domains and multiple use cases in terms of an evaluation. You would want to make sure that you're not buying new software for new use cases.
Or that you won't need to in a year.
Or that you won't need to in a year, precisely, yes. And that is something that we will cover more tomorrow in our final session of the series, which is beyond the first use case. So, you're sizing for the first use case, you're trying to get some quick wins, but then if things go well, you should be doing much more of this. What does that look like? How would you set yourself up for that? And how would you plan for that? And what expectations should you be setting internally about the fact that could and should be happening? So that'll be our final session tomorrow. And with that, I think we are done for today. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Thank you for your questions. And I hope we see some of the same names again in our session tomorrow.